to Wrestling and Everything Coast to Coast with your host, Buddy Sotello Esquire and Evan Ginzburg. Evan, would you like to introduce our guest for tonight?
Absolutely. Joey Cassata's bio is about 27 pages, so I'll give the abbreviated version. He's toured the country with his original band, ZO2, with Kiss, Alice Cooper, The Scorpions, Stone Temple Pilots, Twisted Sister, etc., so on. He co-wrote and co-produced the IFC hit comedy series Z-Rock, and he's worked on that show with Joan Rivers, Dave Navarro, Darryl Hall, Chris Jericho. There's another wrestling connection, Dee Snider, etc., so on. And he's been on Broadway with The Great Comet of 1812. I love the theater, and I'm very impressed by that. He also toured the world with the Trans-Siberian Orchestra for over 10 years, and he's here promoting Wrestling with Joeylicious, the book and the series. There you go. And I watched the first episode. I was marking out. There's Roddy Piper in his bedroom. Roddy Piper putting him in all kinds of holds and torturing him. So very impressive and eclectic Joey Cassata joins us tonight. Welcome.
Well, yeah, and good night, everybody.
That's the show, folks. Yeah.
Listen, we might as well say I can't live up to the hype off of that bio. I don't know who wrote that. It might have been me or my publicist, but I can't live up to it. So thank you guys so much for having me. Good night.
Yes. No. I can't even. It's one of the rare times that I read up on a bio of one of our guests, and I don't know where to begin. I don't even know, but I do want to begin at the beginning, and I want to find out what got you to love wrestling the way that you love it so much. What influenced you to get started in wrestling?
So I'm a New York kid. I grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in the 80s. So I was born in 1974. So, my peak years were in the 80s, my big influential years. So I grew up watching Channel 9, WWOR on Saturday mornings. And, I was a big music fan first, of course, like my bio mentioned. I was a big music fan, big Kiss fan. And, it just so happens one day I was flipping through the channel Saturday morning, and I saw this program come on that I had no idea what it was. And it was just these guys. It wasn't guys in a ring, wasn't guys in anything. Just these two guys yelling at each other.
Yes.
And I had to stop. I couldn't click the dials anymore. No remote controls yet. And I had to stop and just watch. And, at that time, because I was a big music fan, music was all I knew. I didn't hear, there was no internet. I didn't hear interviews of my favorite musicians. I never heard Kiss even speak up until this point. So when I saw these two bigger-than-life characters on TV yelling at each other, and those two characters happened to be Jimmy Snuka and Don Morocco.
Oh, yeah.
And they were yelling at each other, and I just had to stop, and I said, wait, don't change the channel. And from that moment on, I didn't even know what it was. I didn't know it was wrestling. I didn't know it was fighting. I didn't know what it was. All I knew was I had to see more about these two guys and what they were yelling at each other about. I was so enthralled at what I was seeing, I had to see more. And that was really the first moment that I really got hooked into this world of professional wrestling. From that moment on, I was hooked on WWF television at the time, never missed an episode. Shortly after I realized, hey, they're at Madison Square Garden every month. I have to go see it. So, I ran to my local mall, Kings Plaza in Brooklyn, and I went to Ticketron at the time and said, give me your best tickets. Give me your best tickets for Madison Square Garden. And the first night that I ever saw was, I think it was December 1983. And give me your best seats. So I was so excited. Unfortunately, they were all the way up in the blue seats. My nose was bleeding watching these wrestlers, but I still had my signs. I still had my Jimmy Snuka sign because he was my favorite, growing up.
Yes. What was the main event that night?
The main event was Mass Super. I think it wasn't December. I think it was November. I think it was Mass Superstar versus Bob Backlund.
I was there. I was there. Yeah.
Were you there?
Yeah.
I'm not positive of the month. I think it was November because I do remember I saw wrestling at the Garden every month after that for maybe 2 years. Shortly after, saw Backlund lose to the Sheik, saw Hogan win the title for the first time. So,
Wow.
You can imagine these are my golden years anyway, and the golden years of what I consider wrestling. I was hooked for life.
How was that being in the audience for Hulk Hogan winning the title for the first time?
Again, you got to understand, I don't really know Hulk Hogan at this time. I saw him briefly on television. He came out as Bob Backlund's partner against the Samoans that one Saturday morning that I watched. And, I knew him from Rocky III, just like everyone else knew him back then. But I didn't really know him, looking back from the AWA days. I didn't know that Hulk Hogan. So all I knew was this giant behemoth of a man with golden blonde hair was going to come save the day and beat the Iron Sheik. Because back then there was, the storyline was Backlund couldn't do the
clubs.
Do the rematch.
He got beaten up with the juggling
clubs. He got beaten up, of course. So he got hurt. He got injured. So he couldn't do the rematch. So Hogan stepped in his place to save his honor, and Hulkamania was born.
Wow, that's a big moment. That you don't meet a lot of people who are actually there, in the audience for that particular moment. So that's really great. So that led into because you were so did it really influence your musical career or what you did, as far as music goes, or how did you combine the two of those?
Well, it really influenced my whole life. I didn't really have a father figure growing up. My parents got divorced when I was really young. So these wrestlers became, good or bad, my male role models growing up. And I think my personality, you can see me talking with my hands, my personality still some 40 years later is based off of 1980s wrestlers promos. That's all I knew growing up. You know what I mean? That was my male role model. That's what what I modeled everything that I did after. So it kind of bled into my musical career. I had these two paths growing up. I was either going to be, my dreams were the drummer in Kiss or the WWF champion. And, unfortunately, back then I didn't really have anywhere to train as a wrestler. I didn't know where to go. Drums were a much easier thing. Got a set of drums for Christmas, studied, went to school for it, played in bands. So it was a much, not so much easier path, but it was a path that I at least knew what to do. So, the wrestling dreams started to go by the wayside just because I didn't know how to pursue it. Just like every other kid probably, I had a room in my house, wall-to-wall wrestling mats that I bought I got for Christmas one year. We called the room Madison Square Room, and we would have, all my friends over, and we would have a wrestling league. And, literally to win the match, we would have to throw each other out of the room. That's how you would win.
Yes.
So, but, besides that, that slowly started to give way to the musical dream. And that's why in my bio, you hear it so heavily in the music world.
Oh, that's great. And so tell us, your musical resume is unparalleled. Trans-Siberia Orchestra right there. Just that alone would be enough that we could talk about that for an hour, I'm sure, because it sounded like that. Tell us a little bit about that experience, because I'm fascinated when I read that on your resume. And how did you get involved with them?
So music has been my life. Like I said earlier, even than the wrestling, seeing Hogan win the title, I saw Kiss at Madison Square Garden when I was 5 years old on the Dynasty tour. I saw them. They looked like bigger than life superheroes to me.
Oops.
And from that moment on, I knew I had to be a wrestler or a musician. So I, like I said, I pursued the world of a musician, became a drummer, went to a performing arts high school in Manhattan. And from there, I was in and out of bands throughout the 80s, throughout the 90s, toured a little bit. My band ZO2 wind up touring with Kiss and all the big 80s bands back in the day. And we wind up getting our own TV show, Z-Rock. And on that show, we literally played real-life versions of ourselves, much like Curb Your Enthusiasm and Larry David. And the premise of the show was we were a rock band at night and a kids band during the day. And that's really what our lives really were at that point. rock, it's very hard to make a living as a rock musician. So we would pay the bills of our touring expenses and our album expenses by playing kids' birthday parties, bar mitzvahs, communions, anything you can think of. And believe it or not, we made a phenomenal living. We were playing to these upscale, Upper East Side, rich families, Robert De Niro, Al Roker's party, all these big,
Wow.
Upper East Side people. And we were making a great living. And we wound up being at a party one day playing for a kid's birthday party. And an agent from one of the biggest agents in the country, William Morris, was there. And he saw us. He's like, you guys don't look like the Wiggles. What are you doing playing, what are you doing playing, a kid's 5-year-old birthday party? Well, we said we're actually a rock band tonight. This is just our day gig. We're playing Times Square at BB King's tonight. Why don't you come and check us out? Long story short, he came to see us, told us he has to do something with us. And, from there, the TV show Z-Rock got developed. We got 2 seasons on IFC. It was the #1 rated show on IFC. And that's what, you were talking about in my bio. Guest stars like Dee Snider and Joan Rivers and Chris Jericho wind up making an appearance too.
And did you get to work with Chris Jericho directly?
Oh, sure. The whole episode. So again, like I said, the premise of the show. So one of the episodes, we play a kid's birthday party, and the theme of the party is a wrestling themed birthday party. And Chris Jericho happened to be the guest of the birthday party. And, my character on the show was kind of like this cool Italian guy from Brooklyn, never kind of, was goofy. The other 2 guys in the band were a little bit goofy, but when I saw Chris Jericho on the episode, I marked out like a fanboy, like a 13-year-old schoolgirl. And I started screaming and crying and clapping.
Yes.
And, sure enough, at the end of the episode, he winds up insulting my beautiful Italian nose. And, we wind up getting into a little fight, and he winds up breaking his ankle. And I'm mortified because I broke my hero's ankle. But Chris was an absolute pleasure to work with. And that's kind of where the spin-off almost of this other show that I created, Wrestling with Joeylicious, started.
Yeah, and so explain to the audience about that show and how that actually, how you put that together and what it takes to make a show like that. Because I can tell you, just doing this little show here takes all my wits' end just to put this show on once a week. What you're doing there is on a whole different level. It's a really major production, and I'm super impressed by it. So tell us a little bit more about the makings of that show.
So from Z-Rock, like I said, I was a musician my whole life up until that point. But once we did Z-Rock, I kind of got the acting bug. And from Z-Rock, I decided to take the Sylvester Stallone Rocky route where, I couldn't get booked for another show. But you know what? Let me write a show based around myself and a world I'm very familiar with. And I couldn't think of a better world than professional wrestling. I was a fan my whole life. I said, you know what? It's time to go back and revisit it. I couldn't be a professional wrestler. So I said, you know what? I'm going to write myself as a professional wrestler. So I literally wrote this show, created it, wrote the episodes, and I started pitching it around Hollywood and around New York. And we got a lot of great bites. A lot of big production companies wanted to pick it up. And, I'm sure, like Evan spoke before, we got all the wrestling legends you can think of on board, starting with Jimmy Snuka was the very first episode we filmed. And once we got Jimmy Snuka on board, everyone else started to file in line. I was getting voicemails every morning from guys like Ted DiBiase, King Kong Bundy. Jimmy Hart left me a message, about a 20-minute message one morning, screaming at me, "Hey, baby, you got to wrestling with Joeylicious without Jimmy Hart, baby." And I couldn't believe it. I would wake up to text messages from Ric Flair saying that he heard about this great show, that he wanted to be a part of it. So it really just started to snowball from there. Unfortunately, with COVID, production just shut down. Everything, we had a really major deal in place. And because of COVID, everything wound up shutting down. So I just don't have it in my nature to kind of sit back and say, okay, I'm going to wait. Because who knows how long this COVID thing is going to be around. So I said, okay, why don't we do this? Let's pivot and turned the first season of Joeylicious into a novel.
Here you go.
And that's what we did. We turned, this is really the first 5 episodes of what you'll see eventually on hopefully, whether it's Netflix, Amazon Prime, whatever it is, of Wrestling with Joeylicious.
Oh, wow. Okay, that's great. And, later at the end of the show, you'll be able to tell everyone how they can get their copy of it.
Absolutely.
How they can get in touch with you. I definitely want. Now, I don't want to totally monopolize this interview. I'm sure Evan has a question to ask.
I have plenty of questions, including I used to go see Max Roach and Andrew Cyril do 45-minute to an hour solo drum concerts.
Wow.
Who are your favorite drummers?
I mean, there's so many to name. Of course, the original drummers like Buddy Rich, all of those guys back then, they're incomparable. They'll never be touched. Those big band drummers are the best drummers in the world. Gene Krupa, Buddy Rich, all of those guys. But obviously, me being a rock musician and growing up in the 70s and the 80s, guys like John Bonham, I mentioned Kiss earlier, Peter Criss, guys like that really influenced my playing. But of course, I was influenced with the early drummers, and that's kind of how I got into the Broadway world too. I started, I didn't want to just be a rock drummer. I wanted to kind of branch out and do a lot of other things too.
I once saw Art Blakey do a concert. People were dancing in the aisles, and there were no vocalists. They were just
Nothing.
The music captured them, and it was amazing. And I grew up on great jazz drummers because my parents turned me on to jazz, and later, I became a big R&B fan. I grew up in a black neighborhood in Brooklyn. I grew up in East Flatbush, Brooklyn, a little before you,
Right?
And guys like Marvin Gaye and Teddy Pendergrass started out as drummers. A lot of people don't realize.
Let's not forget poor departed Neil Peart.
Of course. But, back then, Evan, like you were saying, drummers were the front men of the band. They were the band leaders. They were the heartbeat. And they were the heartthrobs too. Those are the people the girls wanted, and all that stuff. It wasn't until the 70s and even the Beatles really that started to have, and Elvis maybe was really the first that had the singer be that main focus. It used to be the drummer. I don't know what happened to us.
Yeah. I
Bill
saw
Collins.
Buddy Rich.
Maybe that started the trend away from good-looking drummer singers.
Phil, I didn't say that, by the
way.
Joey, you mentioned marking out the Chris Jericho. I'm the same way when it's an artist that I really love from when I was a kid. Like I met Al Green and he started singing "Let's Stay Together" to me. I was marking out, who are you most impressed with as a musician? Who are you most impressed with?
I mean, it's so hard to say because, there's so many different aspects of being a musician. There's just pure musicianship, and then there's also the rock stars. So there's so many different levels of musicianship. It's hard to say that's the guy that I would mark out for, or that's the guy I'm most impressed with, because what I am most impressed with is, and I've almost kind of gravitated towards that, and I didn't even realize I was doing it until you guys read my bio. Guys like Gene Simmons from Kiss, where they're not only great musicians, great songwriters, but they're such great businessmen, where they're not pigeonholed. Where unfortunately a lot of these R&B guys and Motown guys and big band guys back in the 30s, 40s, and 50s totally, I don't want to say the word, but raped on their music because they didn't have the business sense that they really could have had. So, lucky for me that I grew up such a big Kiss fan that they taught me how to not only be a musician and a rock star, but a businessman. So, now, as an adult, I know how to copyright and trademark and, write things and do things the correct way rather than just be a musician. So, the guys that I mark out for and I respect most are the well-rounded guys like that who really understand. And even a guy like Chris Jericho, who constantly reinvents himself, and
Yeah.
he can always, as soon as that one fad that he's doing, whether it's the list or whatever he's doing, he'll change pace right at the peak because he knows he can't ride that wave forever, and he's going to change his pace. And he goes to Japan, and then he goes to AEW, and then he does his cruise. So guys like that with great business sense is who are the guys who I admire the most.
Herb Albert, a tremendous businessman. Yeah.
Oh,
And a great artist. Yeah,
yes.
Well, and Jericho had his own band too, Fozzy, right?
Yeah, still does. Well,
Yes.
I opened for Fozzy on many, many occasions. I actually jammed with Fozzy. I was a guest on the last Chris Jericho cruise. We jammed together on a couple songs.
Wow. Well, that kind of brings me back to one of the things I want to get back to your origins and how all this got started. And maybe a deeper question, which is that, or thought, which is that wrestling didn't really start getting super popular until it embraced rock and roll. When the wrestling of my earlier days, there was no ring music, wrestling was a very, cut and dried thing. You didn't have even music in between the segments or anything like that. They, when they would show highlights or anything of the matches, they didn't even have background music to that. It was all very basic production kind of thing, just, simple camera work and that sort of thing. And it wasn't until the rock and wrestling connection, right? And bringing in Cyndi Lauper and all of that wrestling had a handshake with rock and roll, and wrestling exploded. That's no coincidence. So tell me more about how you feel the rock and wrestling connection, not only what it means in your life, but where do you think it might take rock and wrestling for the future, as both are kind of struggling right now with COVID?
I mean, you hit it right on the head. Again, particularly right for my generation, that was exactly when I was getting into wrestling. And I really think, WWE has a nice way to rewrite history all the time. So they forget that storyline with Cyndi Lauper and Lou Albano just happening to be in that video really sparked this whole connection. I don't know if the connection would have ever been made and if Albano wasn't in that Girls Just Want to Have Fun video. And from that moment, obviously MTV was the it channel back then. When they did, was it War to Settle the Score, the first MTV special?
Yeah, I think it was the Brawl to Settle It All.
Brawl to Settle It All, right. So those two were really the start, to me, of all modern day wrestling. All of that started right there because of MTV, because wrestling, like you mentioned, almost was like this weird underground type thing that older guys like, and maybe even old ladies, because I remember my grandmother used to love it and stuff too, but it wasn't it wasn't the cool thing to like. And then when MTV started airing it and Cyndi Lauper endorsed it, and then obviously WrestleMania came along and they had all these big celebrities involved, that's when, okay, now it's mainstream. Now it gave it the little sprinkle of magic. It's okay for the public to like this. And
Hulk Hogan
really
was
what
on the cover of Sports Illustrated.
And it legitimized everything that they did. It really did.
Joey, tell the listeners, the viewers, what it was like to see Roddy Piper as a heel at the Garden. I tell people he would hit the ring. It was absolute carnage. 10, 15 minutes later, you could breathe again. That's how exciting it was.
It was, again, I'm a big Hogan mark again. So I saw Hogan win that title. So I'm 10 years old at the time. I lost my mind. So Piper is his bitter enemy at the time. You could feel the hatred in the air when he hit that, as soon as he walked through the curtain, everyone, if they could get their hands around Piper's neck, they would have done it. So it was nothing like I've ever seen, and I've really never seen again.
Yeah, unbelievable.
Yeah.
So you've never actually done anything like in any federation, or you've never actually been a wrestler or done any managing of any particular feds?
No, again, just as an actor, like I said, the episodes of Wrestling with Joeylicious are streaming on Amazon Prime right now. We filmed with the late, great Roddy Piper. So, I did train a little bit, just got some tips to take some bumps in those episodes, run the ropes a little bit, do stuff like that. So I did get a little bit of training, but never had any official matches. I would love to. I have a feeling my body would disintegrate at this point, but I'm an actor, not a wrestler.
Good move, by the way. As someone who had to take his share of bumps, I'm telling you, you made the smart choice.
Oh my God! The first one I took, I was like, I can't believe. I didn't know to tuck my chin and all that stuff. When I took the bump and my head hit the mat, I said, okay, I think I'm going to write a different show.
Yeah, but there is, I think, a lot of correlation between performing as a rock musician and performing as a wrestling personality. And I am no musical talent. My brother is the one who's the musician. But
he's a bass player. I'm not sure if he's a musician.
Exactly. Oh,
no, I'm kidding.
He watches every week, and he'll love that. He'll love that quip right there. But but there, I know I do watch him perform, and I think there's that suspension of disbelief. And I'm not saying that that's what it is when you're a musician, but it's people are into it, that they are forgetting for a moment. You can see, if you're the right kind of performer, you can see your audience getting into you, and they're forgetting about what's bothering them for even that moment. And is that the sort of thing that keeps you performing, to try to get that connection with an audience?
1000%. Again, it's called the performing arts for a reason. It's not just music, acting, theater. They're all connected. They really are. Obviously, some are different than others, especially acting, because, with performing, whether it's touring the world like I did or doing Broadway shows, I did 8 shows a week for, 5-6 years straight. I did almost 700 performances, seeing a sold out audience every night. You get that feedback immediately, and it electrifies your system. Whereas acting, not on a stage, but in front of a camera, is different because you're not getting that instant gratification, but you're still performing, because you do know eventually the audience gets to see that, and you get that. It's a different kind of gratification, but you do get it eventually when it premieres, or you get feedback, especially now with social media. You're getting that feedback eventually. So all of those performing arts are all geared towards the same thing. It's that same, you're trying to get that reaction from an audience that you got once before, and you're trying to recreate it and recreate it and recreate it. You can't get enough. It's almost like being a drug addict.
It is. And that was leading me maybe to another element. And, it's a tough question, but I like to ask tough questions because that makes people think, and I get good answers that way. What happens when that gets taken away? How do you manage it when there isn't a gig? And when the audience doesn't react to you the way that you want it to, or you make something and it's a flop, how do you deal with that? How is that something that you cope with?
Well, for me, again, I wrote my autobiography a couple of years ago too, and it was all about never giving up on your dream. And that's really what it comes down to. As long as you have that vision in sight, you're going to fail more times than you're going to succeed in your life. It's just it's a given. So you have to be able to push through those failures. And those are the people that ultimately succeed in whatever they're doing. You can't, if you're afraid of failing, you're never going to succeed to the level you want to succeed. And that's kind of been my motto my whole life. I've failed 1,000,000 times, but I'll pick myself back up and dust myself off and go ahead into my next project and my next project and my next project. So when you say, the stage is dark like it is right now during COVID, what do? I'm a performer. I tour. That's what I do for a living, and that's what I do for enjoyment and as a hobby. So what do I do to kind of get that fix other places? So like I mentioned, instead of, filming my Wrestling with Joeylicious show with these legends, I wrote the book and I released the book, and I get gratification that way. I do podcasts. I have my own podcast. I do interviews. I do, signings and stuff like that. So you still get that fix until the next big event occurs.
Joey, you're a true Renaissance man. I mean, you're author, actor, musician, etc. So this popped into my head. If you could choose one, would you rather have a Tony, an Emmy,
Ooh.
an Oscar, a Grammy? What would be the one that would mean the most to you?
If you would have asked me growing up, it wouldn't have even been a question. A Grammy is, that's the pinnacle because I'm a musician. That's what I want. Okay, I'm a Grammy award-winning artist. But, over the years, I'm not sure. I want one of every one of those. That's what I want.
Or would you want
I
a
don't want
12-year-old? Or would you want a 12-year-old to come up to you and say that he saw you play and that was the coolest thing he ever saw and he wants to be just like you? Would that mean more?
Believe it or not, you're right. And in a way, like I said, with my autobiography that came out, I wrote my autobiography originally for my kids. I didn't think it was going to be a big seller. I have my fan base, but it wasn't a big market book like the Chris Jericho books or the Mick Foley books or, the Gene Simmons of the world or, Mark Cuban of the world. So when I wrote this book, I literally wrote it for my kids just to say, okay, hey kids, your dad did some fun, crazy, cool stuff in his life. Read about it one day. And then, as I started sending sample copies around, I was getting such great feedback, not even so much of the cool accomplishments, because, the first half of my book is growing up in Brooklyn, going to Catholic school, being an altar boy, having the nun literally cut my hair in her office because I was,
Wow.
against, the dress code in my Catholic school, and going through, all the hard times of growing up as a poor family in Brooklyn. And then the second half of my book is all my accomplishments, whether it be TV, Broadway, or touring and stuff like that. But the thing that I got the most pleasure out of, I figured, okay, no one would care about the growing up in Brooklyn stuff. Everyone would care about, what Broadway actors do you know? What was Joan Rivers like on set? Nobody cared about that stuff. All the great feedback I got and the heartfelt stories that were relating to mine was growing up as a Catholic Italian in Brooklyn and all the hard times I went through. So that was one of the most gratifying things that I've ever done in my whole life.
There you go. What do you consider, as far as live performances, some of the highlights? Because you played with everyone everywhere. I mean, what meant the most to you? What was the most thrilling?
I mean, of course, my opening night on Broadway, having, Josh Groban was the lead of our show, The Great Comet of 1812. I never dreamed of being a Broadway musician growing up, but when it finally happened, I realized the pinnacle of someone would say that the pinnacle of being a musician and being a great musician is maybe having their own chair on Broadway. And I really did feel that when it first happened. I didn't even realize it until the very first night where we got our standing ovation and the encores and, all that stuff. And, went to the Tony Awards and opening night at the Plaza and all that stuff. So I never realized I wanted that as much as I did. But when it happened, I realized what an amazing event and accomplishment it really was.
And how do you want people to remember you one day? You're still relatively young. You got a good 30, 40 years ahead of you being a creative person. But how would you most like to be remembered? You've done so much already.
For me, again, going back to my autobiography, it's really about if I can have an influence on someone to follow their dream through any obstacle, whatever it is. I don't care if you're 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, or 80. Just because you're a certain age does not mean it's time to give up on your dream. If you want to do something, don't let the guy next to you tell you, hey, that's stupid. You can't do that. You know why? The only reason he's saying that because he gave up on his dream and he can't succeed anymore. That's the guy you don't listen to. Kick him away and go the other direction and follow your dreams. So if I can influence anyone by reading my book or just listening to any interview I ever did, I'm all about positivity and following your dreams to fruition. Are you going to succeed at everything? No, but maybe a failure opens up the better door along the way.
Absolutely. Let me just add quickly. I was one of the producers on The Wrestler and 350 Days. I've been involved in the arts for 30 years, 40 years, and I tell young people, never let people discourage you. Follow your dream, but have a plan B. Get a good education, get a degree, get some kind of job skills in the event that you can't make a living at it, because there's plenty of artists, who cannot make a living at it. So, but I never tell people, oh, what are you, crazy? You want to be a writer? You want to be an actor? You want to be a musician? You don't tell young people that. You tell them, go for it. Go for it. Absolutely.
Absolutely. And of course, the plan B, you're going to fall back on throughout the years. There'll be years, there'll be downtime where, your art is not paying the bills and paying the rent. So there's always other things to do, but don't let those other things take away from your dreams. Work all day long at the restaurant, work all day long at your hospital, work all day long as a bus driver, whatever you have to do. But when you get home, no matter how tired you are, write, produce, record, do anything. I remember even when I was on Broadway, one of my first shows on Broadway, again, we're playing the same show so many times. So now it's kind of like just going through the motion in my brain. So I can do the show. I'm still reading my chart, but I can kind of do it with my eyes closed.
Right.
So, I remember one night I literally wrote a full episode of Wrestling with Joeylicious during Act 2 of my play in my brain. And I literally ran backstage afterwards and jotted it down on my iPhone and had the episode written in my head. So never let something else stop you from doing something else.
And let me just also add in and hone your networking skills.
Yes.
It's all about networking. And as Joey said earlier in this program, learn the business end. Don't be exploited. Too many people have been exploited, whether it's a young wrestler, a young rapper, a young singer, whatever the case may be. You get that dream contract, you sign it, they don't even have a lawyer with them. It's ridiculous. Too many people have been burned.
I'm so glad you said that, Evan, because people today, especially young people, don't realize even what you're talking about. And it's almost as important as the art you're trying to perfect, whether it's writing, musician, theater performer, actor, whatever it is. That networking side of the business, of show business, is, I call it 50-50 with whatever your art is, because no matter how good you are, if you're sitting in your basement, no one will ever hear how good of a musician you are, how great of a writer you are. You have to go out there and kick open doors and pull down the curtain and force people to listen to your music, acting, read your play, read your story, read your book. That otherwise it doesn't work. Don't fear rejection. It's going to happen. You know who rejects you? People who probably are jealous of you. That's who people reject. So don't worry about getting rejected. Worry about 20 rejections will lead you to the right acceptance.
There you go, buddy.
I have some questions circling back about the Trans-Siberian Orchestra and going on tour with them, because I think for a lot of musicians, their dream is to go on tour with a major act like that. Can you share with the audience maybe like some of both your high points of traveling with the Trans-Siberian Orchestra, and maybe some of your low points too, if you want to? There's usually a good story to that.
So two of my gold records back there are from TSO. So TSO, I was never a full-time member of TSO. I've been the backup drummer for almost 15 years in Trans-Siberian Orchestra. I rehearse with them every year. They fly me out to all these shows to rehearse and perform, but I was never fully on tour with them. So I know maybe you got a little confused with that, but I was never officially on the road with them full time. I've been a member of the band for, like I said, since 2004, so over 15 years now. And I'm always on call. I don't get a call that often. If I ever do, I'm ready to go. But in a way, it's even more stressful than being on tour with them because I always have to be ready during the holiday season. So it is one of the biggest touring acts in the world every year. The production is bigger than life. Being on that stage, having pyro and fire and sparks and knowing exactly what you have to do, that is what really kind of prepared me for Broadway. And that's really how I got my first Broadway gig too. One of the members of Trans-Siberian Orchestra with myself was the MD of this new Broadway show, and he brought me into the Broadway show. And that's how that kind of, the worlds kind of interconnected.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. How did that come about? How did you first get contacted by, or did you contact them?
So my band ZO2, the bass player for Trans-Siberian Orchestra for I guess for over 15 years was a gentleman named David Z, and he was the bass player in my band ZO2. David unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago in a car accident on the side of the road. It was really tragic, but he's the one, members of the Trans-Siberian Orchestra's management kind of saw us perform at Jones Beach one night opening for Kiss, and they called me in. They said, listen, we love your playing. We love your style. Would you mind coming in to audition? Of course, I knew the Trans-Siberian Orchestra. I jumped at the chance, auditioned, had me play a couple songs, perform a couple things with them, and next thing I knew, I had a contract in front of me.
That's amazing. Yeah, and I guess, talking about the networking and making things and being able to be in the right place at the right time. People say you have to be in the right place at the right time, but you have to be somewhere else than your house a lot of times.
That's the perfect thing to say. Everyone always says, be at the right place. You have to be at the right place at the right time. But you know what? You have to be, first thing you have to do, be someplace. Be someplace, because you don't know. If anyone knew where the right place at the right time was, it'd be so crowded you couldn't get in. Yes. So it doesn't mean you can't get there. Just be somewhere doing what you love, doing it to the best of your abilities, and someone will see you and give you opportunity.
Joey, you know what happened? I was an agent, and I was with Nikolai Volkov and Johnny Valiant doing a signing, and somebody from the Wrestlers showed up, and they're like, you guys would be perfect for this. And next thing I know, we had a meeting. You're just in the right place at the right time. Yeah.
But if you're not there doing that with them, if you're home on your couch eating potato chips, watching, Seinfeld or something, that never happens. Exactly. You have to be out there in the world that you love, doing things you love with the passion and energy that's being fed to the world, and someone will grab you and say, we need your talents.
Well, that's why I'm glad to have this podcast, so that, I can't go out to New York to hang out with you, and you can't come out to California. So we do this wrestling and everything coast to coast to make up for the fact that we're all stuck at home. And I wouldn't have had the opportunity to meet you, virtually like this. And it's been, fantastic. I want to know a little bit more also about your outlook for the future, because I think you're the kind of person that is, like you said, you're not just going to hide in a corner during this COVID time. You pivoted, you made your book, and what's next? How do you think that, and on a bigger echelon, how is rock and wrestling going to go to that next level? Because they're both affected by COVID in almost the same way, by the lack of audiences, the lack of being able to bring people together to work as a team. There's so much about rock and roll and putting on a rock show and doing a wrestling show that there's no small reason why those things keep intertwining themselves throughout the time. So how did both things make it to the future right now?
It's really hard to say. Me being a big wrestling fan and obviously a rock and roll fan, I've unfortunately gotten out of wrestling in recent years because of the lack of audience. It really, to me, has hurt the product so much. From my shirt, obviously, when this NWA Power first came out, I was hooked, line, and sinker. I said, this is the greatest thing I've seen in 30 years. I couldn't believe how good it was. The first episode was okay, but you saw week to week, like back in the old days, them building the storylines each week of each character, feeding off each other. but mainly feeding off that audience too. The interaction of that small studio audience was so important. This was, to me, the future of wrestling. It really was. Going back in time, doing studio shows. And I really think, if this COVID thing lasts a long time and maybe we can't do arenas anymore and we can't do that kind of production, I think NWA has the formula. Go back to studio wrestling, not what WWE is doing right now with the Thunderdome and trying to make believe there's an audience and talking to 1 million people. Don't talk to 1 million people. Talk to 30 people.
Yeah.
Make 30 people in the audience believe what you're saying. And then obviously cameras are filming you. If you can get those 30 people, whether it's on your side or hate you, it's going to translate to the 10 million at home. You don't need to fake talk to, this audience of cameras. I just don't think it's working. I really don't. And I think, the world, and even, going back to my show, things like Wrestling with Joeylicious, to me, having, all of these old time wrestling stars like Evan did with 350 Days, and having these guys in front of the camera again, they're absolute superstars. All of the wrestlers from yesteryear who can't wrestle anymore are magic in front of the camera. We have to utilize their talents. It's not only about in-ring performing. I don't want to see 30 high spots. I want to see a great promo. I want to see a great interview. I want to see a slow burn storyline. That's what I want to see. I think everything has gotten so physical. They need to go away from it and go back to more mental.
Wow, that's it's a common theme that we have definitely had on the show before. People talking about that sort of thing. That's very. Have you ever wanted to be involved in an indie fed or book or do any sort of creative control over indie wrestling?
Oh my God, I would love to. I think it would be a dream come true. I think it would be so much fun. Is it something on the horizon for me? Maybe. Again, like Evan said, I have a couple chapters left to be written in my life story. So I've done this up until this point. Maybe in the future it leads me to that. Something like NWA Power. God, I think I could. I think my brain, loving this business so much, could be an asset to something like that. I love what those minds are doing over there. I think if you can go with people who don't have a closed mind and can really focus on what wrestling used to be and why it is so big today, I think that's the way of the future.
I think that's really. It's nice to talk to someone that has not just complaining about the way things are, but a thought as to how it could be better in the future. That's always more positive, than just saying, oh, well, we should go back to, 20-minute rest holds. And I don't think people exactly want to see, the chop punch contest, and I think a lot has changed too from when we were younger and there was no such thing as the UFC, and that, punching and kicking and that sort of thing was something you could spend 20 minutes watching a match doing. Whereas now you're like, okay, well, if you want to see somebody punch and kick someone for 20 minutes, you can do that with UFC. Let's see, some wrestling moves, some stuff that really involves wrestling and storytelling in the ring, because that's what you won't get from a UFC match. That's not what that's about. And we don't see that, and I that's what I loved about Power as well. And so I when I saw you were wearing that shirt from the beginning of the interview, I was like, okay, that's a really cool deal. So we'll see. Hopefully, some of this stuff can come back, especially if we can get vaccines. And speaking of old school stuff, I want to quickly throw in there the passing of Pat Patterson here in for California and for the Bay Area. Northern California, he was as big a star. He was bigger than life, and a guy that really influenced my love of wrestling as a kid. He was really the Hulk Hogan of my era for this area. When him and Ray Stevens were the two, like Ray Stevens maybe Ric Flair, and you could say Pat Patterson was like Hulk Hogan for us here in the Bay Area, and really a big loss, for him to to be gone, and news of his passing this week.
Buddy, let me quickly add, I saw Patterson wrestle Backlund at the Garden in '79 because I'm 103 years old. And back in those days, the guys would get 1, 2, on rare occasions, 3 main events at the Garden, okay? Patterson and Backlund went 4 straight Garden main events. It's never been done since. Patterson was a huge star, and Patterson was one of the rare guys just as great face or heel, which is very unusual. Piper was not as good as a face. Morocco, Patera were not as good as a face. They were tremendous heels. But Patterson, either or, this guy was so great. And, you know, I kind of cringed when, like, young people think of him as like a comedy figure with Jerry Briscoe. This was one of the top 20 greatest wrestlers of all time. I've been going to wrestling almost 50 years. I'm jaded. I am telling you, Patterson in his prime was unbelievable, unbelievable. And, you know, and a great mind, as they say also, although sometimes WWE got a little cartoonish for me. But Patterson in the ring, boy.
He came up with the idea of the Royal Rumble. It was his idea to create the Royal Rumble, which, you know, now obviously is a mainstay, you know, for the WWE. Well, so we're the only thing that is a problem with this show is that for some reason the hour goes by a lot faster than I ever anticipate. And I want to leave enough time for you to talk about your book, how people can get your book, and future projects that you might have, and how
anything
people
you
can
want to
get
plug, anything.
Yeah, absolutely, please.
So again, the book was never meant to be a book. Hopefully, you know, you could right now you can see episodes. There's the book right there. You could see episodes of Wrestling with Joeylicious streaming on my YouTube page or on Amazon Prime right now. There's 6 episodes streaming right now. They're really fast, 5, 6, 7-minute episodes with guest stars Roddy Piper, Iron Sheik, Jimmy Snuka, Mick Foley, Nikolai Volkov, all these guys, Tito Santana. And, you know, the premise of the show is me as this wannabe wrestler. I'm in my 40s now. I'm wrestling in the indie circuit, kind of in like grammar school gyms to, you know, second graders and nuns. And, you know, I'm waiting for my big break still. And unfortunately for me, these old-time wrestling legends appear to me in my imagination, and they think they're giving me good advice, but it always turns out to be the wrong advice. And as soon as you think I'm going to succeed, I fall again, and I got to pick myself back up next episode, much like Larry David does in Curb Your Enthusiasm. I'm very self-sabotaging in the show. Obviously, these wrestlers are not really there. They star with me in the episode, but I'm the only one that can see them. So that's the premise of the show. And, you know, those episodes are streaming on air right now on Amazon Prime and YouTube. The book is Wrestling with Joeylicious. It was the #1 wrestling book in the country when it came out in September. I texted Chris Jericho for about a week straight laughing that I was beating his book and I was beating the Young Bucks and Jim Ross and all those guys. Don't ask me how I was beating those guys, but for a couple weeks, I was the #1 book in the country. And it is exactly what I just talked about. It's that premise. All of those wrestling stars are in here. Hogan, Steve Austin, all these guys appearing to me in my imagination and kind of guiding me along my wrestling dream journey. Hopefully, you'll see the real show on air very shortly, whether it's going to be Netflix or Amazon Prime. We'll see who picks it up. But anyone out there who's interested in this project, like I said, with COVID, the production is limited now. So please reach out to me. You can get the book on Amazon. Just type in Joeylicious, or you can email me over at joeycassata@gmail.com. Give me your feedback. Let me know if you have anywhere to, help me with this Joeylicious project. We're trying to get it off the ground again. Any help in the wrestling community is greatly appreciated.
And speaking of the wrestling community, I have a friend, Tristan, 23 years old, Bayside, Queens, who's waiting for a kidney. So if any of the wrestlers want to cut like a 30-second promo to encourage them, or also, if they want to send an 8x10 or whatever, he's a good kid and he's going through a hard time. So this is a big shout out to Tristan out in Bayside, Queens. And buddy, anything else?
Well, I just really can't be more impressed with everything that you've done, and you've really been a fantastic guest, and we really would love to have you on another time, especially if we can do what we can to help, Wrestling with Joeylicious, become a bigger thing and tie our audience into it. And of course, you need someone to go on and on and on about all sorts of stuff. I can fill your podcast up with meaningless jabbers, so there never any moments of silence going on. Do you have anything else that you'd like to say to our audience at this time? Just general words of wisdom that you'd like to part us with.
Yeah, just like I said before, never give up on your dream. If you want to be a wrestler, you want to be a ref, you want to be a writer, a musician, whatever it's going to be, just because we're living in this crazy pandemic right now, don't let that stop you. Go on your computer, write a story, write a song, start a podcast, do something, send some emails, look for some addresses that's how I got the wrestlers on my show. How do you think I got them? I networked and found emails. I contacted Mick Foley. I contacted Jimmy Snuka, and I sold my project to them. You could sell your project to anything you want to do too. Just get off the couch and do it.
Wow.
And in defensive basis, Joey was good-naturedly kidding them. Some of the best nights of my life was seeing Larry Graham and Bootsy Collins. Okay.
And who knows? Maybe one day we'll be fortunate to have you come out to California and you can jam with my brother in one of his bands. You can always, as I said to as my brother said, when you're bassist, you'll get all the gigs, you just won't get all the chicks.
Yes.
I would love to. I'm out in California every year for the NAMM Music Convention. Next time I'm out there, we'll try to hook up.
That would be fantastic. I would be. There's so many more questions I'd love to ask you about your musical career, and I really think you have a great idea of how this all connects. There's such a connection between rock and wrestling, and I want to explore that further. So we'll definitely have you on the show at a future date to talk about all that. And otherwise, I think it was a great show, and we'll see everybody next week. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joey.
Good night.
Yeah.
Thanks.